I will, you're gonna get a heck of a lot more than just information on the Earth Day. I'm giving a presentation about Deer Grove. Some of you might know some of this. I'm gonna assume that none of you know any of it, so it might be a little repetitive for some. And I just want to say that I'm a steward at Deer Grove. I've been a steward for about 10 years, but I'm part of a stewardship community at Deer Grove called the Deer Grove Natural Area Volunteers. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And there are many of us. So I am not doing this stewardship work alone. I'm not organizing these events alone. There's a great team of volunteers and stewards that we do this as a group. So, and what I'm going to do is share my screen. Screen share. Can people see that agenda?
Yes.
Okay. And this is the slide one. I'll go into slide mode in a second. So you'll get the full screen. I'm going to walk through these slides. I'm getting some feedback. Is it anyone? I'm going to walk through these slides. I'm going to try and, talk about 40, present about 45 minutes, then do some Q&A for 15 minutes. I got a lot of slides, so it's like, if you don't have any questions, I'm just going to show you some pretty pictures. I have to say at the outset that, you'll notice that myself and Pete Jackson are listed on this slide. And that's because I stole most of these slides from Pete Jackson. So I really just took his deck on Deer Grove and I did some editing, but the lion's share of this work was done by Pete, who is a steward of 25 years at Deer Grove. So I'm now in, everyone can see now a full screen?
Yes.
I can't. Okay, it's good?
Yep, it's exactly what you want, Mark.
Okay, perfect. So the agenda for tonight is I'm going to give you a brief history of Deer Grove West, which is a state nature preserve, and Deer Grove East, which is a state land and water reserve. Then I'm going to just go through the native ecosystems of Deer Grove, talk about what ecological restoration is, and how it fits into the broader context of ecological restoration around the world. We're doing something that lots of folks are doing everywhere. Then I'm going to talk about volunteer stewardship at Deer Grove and the Deer Grove Natural Area, Volunteers. Then I'll I think I just went out of.
Yes, you did. Somehow you're back and.
Sorry, there I am. And what I'm going to do then is do a Q&A after I talk about the volunteers stewardship at Deer Grove. And if we have time, we'll talk about, I'll show you some pretty pictures of plants and animals at Deer Grove. Okay, so I can't see anybody. So if you have a question and want to stop me and ask, that's perfectly fine, but you'll have to speak up or someone will have to recognize you because I can't see anybody when I'm in full screen mode. So without further ado, we're going to start with the history of Deer Grove West. And so if you can imagine what the area around Deer Grove must have looked like in the early 1830s, immediately prior to European settlement. The public land surveyors who were working in the area described it as rolling prairie, dotted with wooded islands of varying sizes. And some of the larger wooded islands on the prairie were the oak groves, and many looked took on the names that might sound familiar: Long Grove, Plum Grove, Buffalo Grove, and of course, Deer Grove. And of course, on a much larger scale than shown here. Beautiful prairie picture. So I gotta love this map. Prehistoric is before 1804. So little dated mindset here. In fact, the Native Americans had already been here for over 10,000 years. European settlement came to the Palatine area in the late 1830s. And on this 1804 map, it's not an 1804 map, but what you can see here in this drawing of early Illinois is, here's Deer Grove, Buffalo Grove, Long Grove up here, but it also shows an Indian, a Native American settlement in Deer Grove and around the paths. So Deer Grove has a long history, not just ecologically, but a long human history. This is the map that the surveyors did in 1838, the Public Land Survey. The surveyors ran lines north and south and east and west on a grid pattern, measuring a mile on each side. And then they had to complete their survey in the area. They would draw by hand a map showing the key landmarks, such as timber, prairie, and major waterways. This hand-drawn map of the Public Land Survey shows that Deer Grove was a wooded area surrounded by prairies. You can see the straight lines is where Deer Grove is currently, Deer Grove West now. This is Deer Grove West. The line, the squiggly line, is where the original grove was, drawn by the surveyors. Interesting, you know, where Deer Grove East is over here, you see it's called Grassy Lake. And this is where we now have this huge invasive wetland in Deer Grove East. Pretty cool. So fast forward another 35 years, this shows the homesteads of the early pioneers in 1861. And the area in red up here is Deer Grove West. And what's really interesting is you see it's a lot of small parcels of land. And what that means is that at this time, what Deer Grove was divided into timber lots shortly after settlement. And it's basically why Deer Grove West was kind of remained intact. It seemed that Deer Grove's rolling and timber covered terrain discouraged farming. And thus the grove was spared agricultural farming, and it was probably used for logging, timbering, and also for some cattle grazing. But for the most part, it survived due to its rugged and rolling topography. The same cannot be said for Deer Grove East, which became totally farmland. So here's the entrance to Deer Grove at Quinton Road in Dundee, circa 1925. And those stone structures are still there today. You can go see them. Quite lovely. And oh, that's what it looks like today. Well, in 2008, when the picture was taken. Not only is the road expanded, but the new growth, both of native and non-natives, has filled in this landscape. We've done a little bit of clearing out of invasives in this area, and so is the forest preserve. So it looks a little bit better than this picture shows. Okay, we're taking a detour because mainly I want to talk about native ecosystems, but Deer Grove has some amazing cultural natural features. There's the Deer Grove Lake, which is man-made sometime in the early 1900s. There's Camp Reinberg, which is a day vacation spot for workers in Chicago factories during the early 1900s, probably all the way up through the 1930s and 40s. There's the Palatine Lake Zurich Wakanda Railroad that ran through Deer Grove in the 1920s and 30s, which you can still see where the railroad bed went through both Deer Grove East and Deer Grove West. The train would stop and drop folks off at Camp Reinberg. They'd come out and spend the day and swim and recreate at Deer Grove, and then they'd hop on the train back to Chicago. And finally, the Civilian Conservation Corps did some amazing stonework in Deer Grove during the Great Depression, the late 1930s. So just a few photos. Here's a picture of Deer Grove Lake circa 1903. We got this in the archives of the Forest Preserve. Eddie Z, one of our volunteers, discovered this. It's quite amazing. You can see the grassy slopes back here. There isn't an invasive plant to be seen. Circa 1903. This is before the Forest Preserve was formed. Here's Camp Reinberg. I don't have an historical photo of Camp Reinberg, but we often run across volunteers and users of the Forest Preserve who tell us about going to summer camp and Camp Reinberg, church camp, scout camp in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. They've done a major renovation of Camp Reinberg in 5-10 years ago, and this is the new dining hall. And it's really a great place to go camping. You can take your trailer there. They've got primitive campsites as well. Not so primitive because the restroom facilities are great too. But Camp Reinberg, again, predates the Forest Preserve and continues to be a great asset to the Forest Preserve. Here's that dam. I think this is a new dam. I think this was built in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. If you haven't been and walked around this dam, it's just gorgeous. The stonework, it's unusual to see this kind of stonework in America, right? It's just well done, well built, and it's a beautiful, beautiful structure. But not only is there a dam, there's this 1/4 mile long stone wall that runs along the lake. And we just did a restoration project this past winter where we cleared up around that wall. It used to be kind of covered up with buckthorn and other invasive stuff. The scout troop came out and cleared that out over 2 or 3 work days. And this is what it looks like now. And pow, this is what it looked like in the 1930s. This is that same wall I just showed you a picture of. You'll notice up here the sandy beach. That is not a natural feature of this landscape. I can assure you there's no sand on that's native to the ecosystems around here. So I'm sure they poured in a ton of sand, but you can see this is where people in the 1930s and 40s and 50s came to recreate, to swim, to fish, to boat. And those folks are sitting on the wall, and just on the other side is the beach. And again, if you look through the woods here, you look in this area, there's no buckthorn, there's no multiflora rose. On the other side, you can see a very open landscape, which right now it's very wooded and dense on the other side of that lake. And this is the outflow for what we call the Big West Marsh, a lovely remnant wetland that really hasn't seen a lot of it's degraded, but for various other reasons, but it wasn't cropped. And this is the outflow and the beautiful bridge that the CCC built over that outflow. Again, these are things you can walk. This is on the Yellow Trail on the west side of Deer Grove West. You can go look at this stonework and it's quite lovely. And if you walk the Orange Trail at Deer Grove West, which is the road that came in off of Elah Road and goes all the way to Quinton Road, or used to go all the way to Quinton Road. I think in the 50s and 60s, the idea was that you drove through Deer Grove, you didn't walk through it. And they had these picnic areas with pumps that you could stop your car and get out and picnic. And they have all these different overpasses, culverts of beautiful stonework along this now closed road, which is a wonderful walking path at Deer Grove West. The most pretty walk in the spring and fall in Cook County is the Orange Trail at Deer Grove West. I'm convinced it's just very beautiful. I'm a little biased. So anyway, that was the detour, the cultural detour of Deer Grove. Not only is it amazing natural areas, it also has some really important and interesting cultural features that I think are one of its appeal to me anyway. So Deer Grove East has quite a bit different history than Deer Grove West. So Deer Grove West is about 1,000 acres. It's a state nature preserve, the highest level of protection you can have in the state of Illinois for land. Deer Grove East is about 800 acres. It's on the east side of Quinton Road. Deer Grove West is on the west side of Quinton Road. And most of the land east of Quinton Road and Deer Grove East was farmed, except for the area around Camp Reinberg, which was a part of the original grove. The land east was prairie and wetland and was farmed intensively up until about 1950s. Here's a 1938 photograph of Deer Grove East, right? So on the west side here, you can see, this is Camp Reinberg here, right? Here's Quinton Road, here's Camp Reinberg. And here's the rest of Deer Grove East. And it's a bunch of farms, farmhouse, farmhouse, farmhouse. There isn't a single tree between Dundee Road and Lake Cook Road in this 1938 photo. It was intensely farmed. So it means, so originally this was prairie or wetlands. And the wetlands were drained. So basically there was a lot of ditching that went on here to alter the hydrology of this area to make it farmable. Remember that big grassy lake I showed you on that original 1838 survey? That's this area here, which you can see are farmed fields. Now it's just a big Phragmites, reed canary grass, cattail swamp. This is what it looked like before the restoration happened. The Forest Preserve came in and planted lots of trees. All these trees, these groves here, were planted by the Forest Preserve in the 1950s and 60s. Here's that remnant of the old grassy lake and used to be farm fields. You can still see the drainage ditch here.
Yeah, Mark, just to let you know, I am not seeing a cursor on your screen anymore.
Oh, does that work?
Yes, there it is again.
Okay, so I'll use it on the bigger screen, sorry. So here's that old grassy lake, which in the previous photo, all this was farm fields, right? Here are the groves that were planted by the Forest Preserve. In the 1950s and 60s, there was a clamor for forest preserves to have forests. And I don't think there was an understanding of what the native ecosystem was in Deer Grove East. So it's like they planted trees where trees really didn't belong. And what has happened, can you see my cursor now?
Yes.
Okay, so basically this area, the outline in the yellow orange here is the official restoration area. And what these green areas are the restored wetlands and wet areas. They restored 26 wetlands, which used to be basically drained and cropped. They took out the drainage tiles and the hydrology returned to the land, and it was amazing. And the areas around the wetlands are restored prairies, which again is probably what they were originally before European settlement. They cut down a lot of trees, a lot of the reforested areas they cut down. They tried to keep the trees on the west side here, which were part of the original oak hickory woodlands. And this area here is just a highly degraded wetland. It wants to be a wetland. It's invaded, and they didn't make that part of the restoration because it was just too costly. But if you've been to Deer Grove East recently, it's a very high quality restoration. It's an amazing place to hike and bird and walk. The work was funded by wetland mitigation funds from the O'Hara Airport expansion. An organization called Open Lands funded that project, and they did a fantastic job. They did so well managing those funds that what was left over was used to restore 200 acres of woodlands in Deer Grove West over the past 3 to 4 years. If you've not been in Deer Grove West in the past couple of years, you need to take a hike. They've done some amazing restoration on the west side of Deer Grove as well. So any questions about the history before I move on to kind of the natural ecosystems of Deer Grove?
This is Pat. Could I ask a question?
Sure.
So could you just briefly explain for people maybe who could use an explanation? How did it go from being pristine land to invasive species? You know, what kind of, I mean, you talked about farming and tiling, but the wetlands were restored once the tiling was removed. Why didn't the prairies return?
I'll talk about that a little bit later, Pat. I don't want to not answer your question, but I'm going to get to that.
Okay, that's fine.
There's a lot of good reasons why it takes a lot of work to restore a prairie and a little less work to restore a wetland, but it's a lot of work and it ain't cheap. So, but I promise you, if that question doesn't get answered by the end of the talk, we'll come back to it, okay?
Thank you.
Any other questions about the history?
So there was a question in the chat, Mark, from Kim asking, can you point out the location of the dam?
Sure. I'm just going to go back a few slides. Deer Grove West. Oh, I don't think I have a picture of Deer Grove West. I don't think I have a map of Deer Grove West on here. If I do, I will point out it's basically on the southeast end of Deer Grove Lake, but I apologize. I don't have a good map of Deer Grove. I think I'll show you in a little bit here. 1 second. I think I've got one. Again, if I don't get to this. Yep.
Yeah, so, and I have one other question, Mark, and that is, do I remember correctly that Deer Grove West was the very first piece of land that the forest reserves of Cook County acquired?
Oh, did I not say that? Shame on me. We are the first forest preserve in the United States. It's a very historic site. 1916 is when the first land was acquired at Deer Grove West. First forest preserve in the US. Sorry for not mentioning that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is now talk about the natural ecosystems of Deer Grove and then talk about ecological restoration, which is kind of what we do as Deer Grove Natural Area Volunteers. And it's actually one of the main missions of the Forest Preserve. So Deer Grove was a former prairie grove with a variety of ecosystems, an island of woodlands, wooded lands in the midst of a vast prairie. Glacial deposits left the valley very hilly, which slowed down prairie fires and encouraged tree growth, which is why you have groves. Deer Grove is dissected by a network of streams, Salt Creek, it's one of the headwaters of Salt Creek, and punctuated by numerous wetlands. So we have a mosaic of ecosystems and a real high diversity of species. And the ecosystems include forests, woodlands, savanna, prairie, and many wetlands. So cutting through the middle of Deer Grove West is Salt Creek. which forms a ravine. So you have these wonderful forested ravines. Oak hickory woodlands cover most of Deer Grove West and the west portion of Deer Grove East. These are kind of, the difference between a forest and a woodland is a forest has 90% plus tree cover, and a woodland is more open. It has like 50 to 90% tree cover. So it's an open forest, but we call it an open, it's called a woodland is an open forest. Lets in a lot more sun. And that's the nature of an oak hickory woodland, which is the dominant ecosystem in this area with trees on it. Deer Grove East has some extensive prairies that were created during the restoration. And they weren't created, they were restored. This was probably originally prairie, and they were restored to prairie. There's some prairie openings in both Deer Grove East and Deer Grove West, which are just kind of openings in the woodlands with these wonderful, beautiful prairie plants. That is culvert's root that you're seeing there, that beautiful white flowering plant, a high quality prairie plant. And a bunch of wetlands, right? So here I do have a map of Deer Grove West. These blue spots are all the wetlands in Deer Grove West. Can you see my cursor here?
Yes.
Okay, so here's Deer Grove Lake. And to answer the person's question, right here at the end of the lake, this is where it flows out. This is where the dam is, right here. This is the main fork of this of Salt Creek that runs through the ravine, the middle of Deer Grove, and it empties into Deer Grove Lake. And over here is the Big West Marsh that I talked about. It's a beautiful remnant marsh, wetland. So these are the wetlands of Deer Grove West. And I showed you a picture earlier of the wetlands, the 26 or 27 wetlands that were restored in Deer Grove East. So those are the main ecosystems in Deer Grove: woodlands, prairies, savannas, wetlands, right? A savanna is a prairie with 10 to 50% tree cover. So it's more open, more sunlight, and they're actually, it's kind of a, I forget the term. It's basically a transition between a prairie and a woodland, is a savanna. So those are the ecosystems. So now I want to talk about restoring native ecosystems. What is ecological restoration? This is kind of the heart of what's happening here to bring back these native ecosystems to health. So ecological restoration is defined as the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. That's the standard definition from the professional society called the Society of Ecological Restoration, SER. Restoration ecology is a relatively new branch in the field of ecology. I think, it's really as a discipline is really maybe 40 or 50 years old. And it's a pretty young science. And so there's a lot of learning still to be done. And much of that impetus and learning and practice has come through work that's been done in the Midwest. And a lot of it has been done by volunteers. We have some of the oldest and most knowledgeable restoration ecologists, practitioners here in the Chicago wilderness. In a broader context, right now, I learned this just this past week, so this is was news to me. It's the decade of the UN has declared 2021 to 2030 the decade of ecological restoration. I was going to go into this in more detail, but I think it's probably not, what people are most interested in. But there are 10 principles of ecological restoration. And it's the main purpose of this is to maximize the net gain for native biodiversity, ecosystem health and integrity, and human health and well-being across all biomes, sectors, and regions. So in other words, ecological restoration is happening everywhere across the world in all different biomes and all different areas and regions. And so we're part of a larger important movement. So, you know, the phrase think globally and act locally, well, that's what we're doing. The other thing I wanted to point out, again, something I've just been made aware of recently is this restorative continuum. And it's been recently published to show the broad range of restoration from reducing negative human impacts. On the left-hand side here, you reduce societal impacts. Think of picking up garbage, you know, stopping dumping waste into the river, all the way to fully recovering native ecosystems on well, I guess it would be, everyone looking at it would be on the right side over here. And ecological restoration are these kind of the last three categories, but there's other important stuff on the other side. What we do at Deer Grove is mostly those last three, but I think it's important to recognize that good work is being done that isn't ecological restoration, but it's important in good work, reducing societal impacts, improving ecosystems management, repairing ecosystem function. As my children would say, it's all good. Okay, so back to Deer Grove. This gets to the question that was raised earlier. What caused these ecosystems to go south, to degrade? Well, the human disturbance factors since European settlement that caused ecological degradation were fire suppression, which results in a prairie becoming a forest. Or first it goes to the prairie becomes a shrubland, becomes a woodland, becomes a forest. If you don't have fire, the invasive species have all of these ecosystems at Deer Grove evolved with fire. It was part of how they evolved. So the trees, the oaks, the hickories, the plants are all fire tolerant. Invasive species are not fire tolerant. Humans brought them in with their agriculture, with their horticulture, whatever. And these invasive species, in the absence of fire and in the presence of disturbance being something like plowing up the soil, these invasive species just go to town and are very successful. And so if you disturb the soil, invasives come in. If you suppress fire, invasives come in. If you alter the hydrology, invasives come in. So if you're draining the wetland, you know, the wetland plants die. If you build a dam and you flood the valley, the native plants that were in that valley, of course, die. If you drain your water from your lawn into the forest preserve with all the stuff that comes off the roads in your lawn, you know, you poison the native plants. A lot of the invasive plants are very tolerant to pollution. And one final thing that's changed with human settlement is we've lost the native herbivores, the buffalo and the elk, and the apex predators such as the wolves, right? All these things are what cause ecosystems to decline. So the Deer Grove Natural Area Volunteers were established about 25 years ago to kind of help restore these ecosystems. This was before the Forest Preserve was really doing ecological restoration. We celebrated our 25th anniversary last year. We have about 20 to 30, I would say, regular volunteers with a mailing list of about 300. We have 5 stewards, people who are kind of labeled as stewards, but we have many more workday leaders, brush pile bosses, chainsawers, and herbiciders. And all of those folks are really important to restoration happening. At the Deer Grove Natural Area Volunteers, we record about 3,000 volunteer hours in a year. We have close to 100 work days each year. Usually 2 every weekend, and in the summer we have more when we're collecting seeds. So restoring native ecosystems is what the Deer Grove Natural Area volunteers do. And there's a really important caveat here, is that we do all this work under the auspices and guidance of the ecologists and land managers of the Cook County Forest Preserves. We are volunteers. We're working with their permission and their training to do the right stuff. And so people need to know that we're just not going out in the woods and doing what we think is right. We are doing this in conjunction with the landowners, which is the Cook County Forest Preserves, and their trained staff, which are quite well trained. They do good training and all that stuff. So basically what we do on work days is remove invasive species, we collect and sow native seeds. Some of us monitor plants and frogs and butterflies and dragonflies and birds, all those things you can do. We try and teach our volunteers about the native ecosystems. And we also are trying to build a volunteer stewardship community. If you join us on a work day, we like to think it's an enjoyable activity. This is one thing we don't do, which is very important for natural ecosystems recovery, which is fire. This is called a prescribed burn. Remember, these ecosystems evolved with fire, and having these burns in the prairies and woodlands and the wetlands help keep the native plants dominating, and it really pushes back on the invasive plants. If you go out to Deer Grove East, they did a major burn just yesterday, burned half the prairie. It looks lovely, and it's just amazing to see what a burnt prairie looked like. And if you come back in a month, you'll just see a luscious green growth of flora coming up. So what's a work day like? Well, they're about 3 hours, 9 to noon or 1 to 4. They're lots of fun. We all enjoy being in nature and learning about nature. Sometimes we go on a seed collecting work day, and people are they're just looking at plants. They're not doing any seed collecting. It drives me nuts. But we have a good time. I mean, the first thing which is important is that people have a good time. When you do these work days, there's a sense of accomplishment. You clear out an area of buckthorn, or you collect a bunch of seeds. Over the past 25 years, volunteers have cleared out about 100 acres, and we've seen a significant increase in plant diversity. Volunteers were doing this important work before the Forest Preserve kind of got on board. And now the Forest Preserve is doing a great job of ecological restoration in Deer Grove. They have, over the past 10 years, cleared 400 or 500 acres in Deer Grove. And they've done great work. Our work complements and enhances the larger restorations led by the Forest Preserve staff and contractors. We work very closely with the Forest Preserve and our contractors. This is an example, we're showing off the seeds we collected on a work day. On the right-hand side over here, this is a seed processing work day. We get 20 to 30 people come in December, and we process all the seeds that we've collected over the past late summer, fall season. So basically that's my presentation. I'll remind you that there's Earth Day at Deer Grove East, Grove 3, 9 to 3 on Saturday, April 23rd. I didn't type that in. And the event's co-sponsored by the Northwest Sierra Club and the Deer Grove Natural Area Volunteers. So to stop for questions and comments. And then if you have more time, I can just show you some pretty pictures.
Oh man, Jim, that's you who's given us the feedback.
Yeah, sorry. It's my rock and roll persona. So anyway, thank you very much, Mark. We do have some questions in the chat. Let's see. Julie writes, could you comment on how deer and beavers are managed in Deer Grove?
Yeah, they actually, so it's very hush hush what the Forest Preserve does with deer, because it's kind of public, it's a sensitive public topic. But I'm pretty sure they're culling deer in Deer Grove. They're reduced because deer are tremendously destructive to a native ecosystem when there are too many of them. I mean, they're fine to have deer in an ecosystem, but the amount of deer per acre is like 10x or 20x what it should be, because they have no predators, right? So there is deer control in some forest preserves in Cook County. We don't hear much about the details. In terms of beaver, I can't say. I don't think we've had any beaver in Deer Grove. And Amanda, you might know of anything, but I know they're coming back in other places, and in some areas it's a problem because they cause floods. In other areas, it's exactly what you want. They're great ecosystem engineers.
Thanks, Mark. Julie also adds, and a huge thank you for the work you all do. Anne, great job, Mark, and Amanda, great information. Thanks. And Amanda asks, what time are the regular work days?
So we have regularly scheduled work days Saturday from 9 to noon and Sunday from 1 to 4. They don't always happen on Sundays, but we try and do them every Sunday. And during the summer and fall, we often have midday seed collecting work days in the evenings, but they're not regularly scheduled. But Saturday morning, Sunday afternoon are the two regular times. And you can go to the Forest Preserve website and see when you sign up at the Forest Preserve website, or you can send us an email. I think I have to go down to my last slide. You can show us, you can send us an email and we will put you on our mailing list, and then you would find out about all our work days. We send out a notice once a week, letting people know what's going on.
Great, thanks, Mark. I see Pat has her hand up.
Well, yeah, so Mark, just an interesting thought that came to my mind as you were talking about the deer. When I was doing my environmental science degree, one of the things our instructor had said was, you measure the trees at diameter at a certain height, and it was also the same DBH was also the same diameters at breast height was also the same measurement of diameters at deer browsing height. So that was just kind of a weird thing. Anyway, my question to you was, could you, or are you able to comment on the issues of when does quote unquote restoration begin? You talked about fire suppression. Fire suppression, as I understand it, was part of the native culture, as well as lightning strikes and all that. But what about before that? At what point do you make a decision about this is what we want things to look like?
So, I mean, people are getting really good about like figuring out what the reference, what your kind of end goal is. Like, you want this to be a prairie, you want it to be a wetland, you want it to be a woodland or a savanna, and then you take your actions to kind of move it in that direction. It takes a long time, and it changes over time. And there's early succession prairies and late succession prairies, and you can see how the species change with time. There's a lot of science behind it and a lot of practical knowledge behind it. So it's a planning process that starts from, hey, what does the land want to be, right? What was this land evolved to be? A prairie, a wetland, a woodland, a forest? And then you try and get to that. And, you can't recreate the garden, right? It's like, so you do the best you can and you make adaptations. And so it's kind of, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, there's also people that would say, it's really about how can we get good ecology? It's maybe not necessarily thinking about what are we going to call this, but how can we get the most biodiversity and the most ecology? And so those are, I think, potentially trade-offs in making decisions too, right?
Well, I would argue that probably the best ecology is the one of a native ecosystem, right? I mean, that's kind of what nature intended. So you kind of want to get, you don't want to be, you'd like it to be able to happen without human intervention if possible, right?
Right.
But when you're in the middle of a $8 million metro area, you know, you're not going to wait for lightning to strike and put your prairie on fire. Those are one of the kind of compromises that we make. We're not going to introduce buffalo into Deer Grove. So, you know, there's a lot of good discussion and thought about it.
Okay, thank you.
You know, Mark, it may be about time for you to stop sharing your screen now. It'd be easier to see the chat and the questions there if your.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, Mark. You know, I had a question kind of I was thinking sort of along the lines Pat was when you were talking about declining ecosystems, and you actually mentioned the word succession, and really the human intervention, caused that ecosystem decline is like a secondary succession. So my question is, and you kind of addressed it, I mean, were all those ecosystems that were compromised through man's intervention, were they considered climax successions then? And that can we get back to that?
So I think that's kind of an old ecological concept, climax. Like, you know, it's more complicated. I think that basically that was an early 1900s concept of succession, right? And I think it's so there's always disturbance in a landscape, right? So there's forest fires, which are a disturbance. There's, you know, we used to have passenger pigeons that would come, 1 million passenger pigeons pooping on your forest has a pretty dramatic impact on the ecosystem. So there's all kinds of disturbance which cause things to start over again. So climax is, you know, there's old growth forests and kind of old growth prairies, but they burn and then they start over again. So it depends upon where you start. It depends upon the disturbance. I don't know. I don't have an answer to your question. I'm not an academic, so I can't, but it's not the way people think about things anymore.
Okay.
In terms of climax.
We got a bunch of questions here.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Ann put the email for Deer Grove nav@gmail.com. And then Jan asks, have the ravines now been restored?
Not fully, but they've really come back. It's been amazing. There used to be a lot of mountain bikers that would go up and down those ravines at Deer Grove West. The most damaged areas they fenced off, and they're coming back. It takes a long time to heal, but they're coming back. So it's great progress, but it's not fully restored, I wouldn't say.
Okay, Julie put in a comment. I'm currently going through the process of getting certified to conduct forest therapy walks through the Association of Nature and Forest Therapists. Would love to offer that experience to whoever might be interested.
That's awesome. You know, and I'll tell you, they're in the prettier forest than Deer Grove West. So you ought to be taking your folks for some therapy out in Deer Grove West. I think that the Forest Preserve allows that to happen. I don't think you can charge people to walk in the forest. So I don't know how that works in terms of ethics. You know, walking in the Forest Preserve is free. So, but I think I get it. And I think it's a wonderful thing you're doing. It's very healing. And so I congratulate you on doing that good work.
Yeah.
And, oh, go ahead, Barbara.
Yeah, well, I'm wondering if maybe, maybe we could put some little thing about that in our newsletter, Julie. Send us emails so that we have your contact info, and maybe you could write up an article for the newsletter about, what this therapy stuff is and what you're doing.
Yeah, for Earth Day, we can offer a forest therapy walk.
So I've unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I would love to do that. And, I would love to offer a forest therapy walk free of charge at Deer Grove. It's a beautiful place. Yeah, I would love to send a blurb about forest therapy or forest bathing. Goes by both names. Who would I send that to? If you were going to include that in any of your information.
Yeah,
No?
Jim, put the group's email address into the chat again, will you? I can never
Yeah, sure.
remember for sure what it is.
Yeah, I will. I'll put it here in just a minute.
Okay. All right, I'll get you guys a blurb, and it'd be great to work together. That'd be great.
Thank you. Well, here's the email address right here. Let's see. Okay. And another comment. Mark, what a fabulous presentation. This is from Gwen. I've been going to DGE/W for years, Deer Grove East/West. I get it. Okay. And it was wonderful to hear about the history, see the maps, and learn about all the great restoration that is going on there. Thanks for all your group's great work. Well, thank you for being here. Are there any more questions? I don't see any hands raised or comments in the chat. Did I miss anybody?
I'm just going to tack on one little comment that the last thing, this last comment made me remember. I remember Rick McCandless, who was the steward out at Poplar Creek for quite a while, saying, some people come every week and put in hundreds of hours, and that's really wonderful. Some people come once and contribute 2 hours. But one of the things about this work is no matter which of those things you do, you're making a difference for the land.
Well put, Barbara. Well, we hope you all sign up and get those RSVPs, if you haven't already. So we'd like to see a bunch more people. We got a lot of people last September 25th for NPLD, National Public Lands Day. And, one thing I forgot to mention, but I'm sure it's obvious to most of you, is that when was the last Earth Day we had? Was that 2019 or? Yeah, 2019. Yes. So,
yes.
So it's been, we missed 2 years. So this is like the inaugural post-pandemic. So that's a good thing too. So thanks a lot for coming, Mark. And it's a great idea to have this prep presentation beforehand.